Hey guys, so I was like, oh, I don't have content. What content am I gonna do? I really wish that I could do a book haul, but like I don't really buy books anymore. Then I kind of looked at my shelves and I went, oh, you just been buying nerdy books. By which I mean I've been buying books kind of related to my PhD. And my PhD, which I started last fall, if you aren't aware, is a kind of, for me right now at least, circling the drain on how American history is represented in children's books. Because children's books have for so long been a place where we instill ideology and also where very complicated historical events are, say in a picture book, distilled to just 32 pages and maybe 100 words. So when you are talking about something that is very nuanced and very hard to talk about, a person's, I don't want to say true feelings, but like a real strain of ideology can really just come through there. And it's so interesting to look at picture books, say all about George Washington, and just see the different ways that they tackle his life, how they present the many myths about George Washington's life. Like, I can't tell you how old I was when I realized that George Washington had actually never cut down a cherry tree, but it was real old. Did you know that's a fake story? Because but these are things, right? We talk about, okay, George Washington chopping down a cherry tree. That's not a neutral story. It's a story meant to talk about George Washington's character. And George Washington's character is important because his persona, his personality has been so heroicized in our history, but also is kind of what our office of the president was built around. So that's just one example, but I'm just really interested in this topic, and so I have been starting my tiny PhD library with books, some of which I've read but I bought, and some of which I want to read. So I'm gonna haul those for you guys and I'm just gonna be a giant nerd. So starting with two books that I bought, not because they relate to my PhD necessarily, but because they are two of the best books I think to come out of my presidential/political reading challenge. I have Wildland, The Making of America's Fury by Evan Osnos. This is an incredibly powerful book about America from 2001, 9/11 to 2021, and really encapsulating on a very human level the differences and yet similarities over the gigantic country we live in. It's really good. It's really incredible. And again, talking about how time and memory and space work, there are themes in this. And so I bought it. I also bought Unthinkable by Jamie Raskin. I talked about this in a very recent episode of my reading challenge, and I don't want to go through the whole thing again, but in particular, there's this bit in the end here which talks about memory. I think that it's just really important and could be used in a potential paper or something. I have come to believe that good memory is a building block of mental health and balance, not just for individuals, but also for families, societies, and political movements. What do we remember, and how do we remember it? What do we choose to forget or to lie about? And I mean, in particular, he's talking about the lost cause and the insurrection, but in general, historical memory, it's a weird topic, and that is also part of this. So I did buy this just for me, but I think that it could be used potentially in a paper if I needed a quote or something. Okay, now I'm going to talk about a chunk of books directly relating to George Washington, because he is one of the ways that we have dealt with George Washington's memory is one of the areas that is most interesting to me. And so two of these I've read, and they show up in the same supplementals episode because I did like a whole extra thing on George Washington, but the first one, which I've talked about ad nauseum, is You Never Forget Your First by Alexis Coe. This is not, it's almost an unbiography where she talks specifically about George Washington's life, yes, but also a lot about the lies we believe about George Washington's life and why we believe them. So obviously this is like a touchstone text for me if I do choose to deal with George Washington specifically in the future. Then I have Washington's Farewell, The Founding Fathers' Warning to Future Generations by John Avlon. This is an incredible book on George Washington's farewell address. And not just on the address, but how it has been used by literally almost every kind of political movement that you can possibly think about in the time since then. His words have been used, distorted, the memory of them has been misrepresented. This is an incredible book on how sometimes historical artifacts' meaning can change with time. And in particular, obviously, George Washington's farewell address, it's one of his most important speeches. But just as like the history of words as artifact, I think this is a really great book, so I bought it. I'm actually in the middle of reading this now, but this is called Here George Washington is Born, Memory, Material Culture, and the Public History of a National Monument by Seth Brueggemann. This is definitely a academic text, whereas the Farewell and the Coe, those are more for lay readers. Sorry, this is my bookmark. But this is really interesting because it is the struggle and the memory and the conception and the formation and the battle over George Washington's actual birthplace, not Mount Vernon. It's a place in Virginia's Northern Neck. It's the Birthplace National Monument for George Washington, where he really spent very little of his actual life, which is part of the interesting story about this place. And I've been finding some stuff on Mount Vernon, but we have a very, as I'm understanding from this right now, we have a really interesting relationship with birthplace sites as opposed to lived or historic sites, which is technically what Mount Vernon is. It's very interesting, and I think I'm learning a lot. It's definitely very niche, but again, a historical, deciding what to memorialize at these sites is such an interesting decision, and apparently this site was very contentious, so I'm enjoying it so far, and we'll see if it actually ends up being useful or just me being a nerd. So as I'm looking at memory and America and history and particularly the social studies classroom, I very obviously keep being led back to James Loewen. And James Loewen most famously wrote Lies My Teacher Told Me, Everything Your American History Textbook Got Wrong. And this is an updated version. I haven't read it yet, but literally everything that talks about American history textbooks references this book. So it's like one of those necessary books. And then because I'm doing a project this semester on historic sites, he wrote another book called Lies Across America, What Our Historic Sites Got Wrong. Because again, a textbook is an interesting compilation of choices, but also historical sites and monuments are an interesting compilation of choices, and sometimes it's almost more interesting the people who created the site instead of why the site was created. So again, I haven't read either of these, but they just keep coming up. They're also huge, but they're like clearly something where if I want to go down this path, they are something that I need to read. Speaking of things that are coming up in literally everything I read, I am getting a PhD that focuses on something called critical literacy, and one of the foundational thinkers for critical literacy is a guy named Paulo Freire. Now, Paulo Freire, his work has been incredibly influential. He's also been talked back to since, he was writing a lot of these in the 1970s. But on a philosophical level, a lot of what he wrote about for education is still really relevant. He was informed by a lot of things, but especially Marxism. And so you really get that with this one, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and very ominous looking red book, which was first published in English in 1970 and in Portuguese in 1968. And again, this is quoted all of the time, as well as Education for Critical Consciousness, again, by Paulo Freire. He also has other ones, Pedagogy of Hope, Pedagogy of the Heart, Pedagogy and Process, but these are the two that keep coming up in my readings. So if I make it through these, maybe I'll go to the other ones. But after getting quotes from the same person over and over and over again in some of the things that I'm reading, it has just become so important to me through this history project, but just for me as a person to see those quotes in context, because we all know, we've all written papers in our lives. You can take quotes out of context very easily and they end up having separate meanings. So I want to read through the whole thing, understand the ideas more, understand the quotes in context, and just be better informed by this person who shows up in literally every single thing you're going to read on critical literacy and critical consciousness in education, like ever. So now we're off in the weeds a little bit of some stuff. Two of them I actually haven't bought yet. They're on their way, but I wanted to film this. So the first one I'll just talk about is Biography in the Lives of Youth by W. Bernard Lukenbill. Despite the rise of Common Core standards and the rise of nonfiction for children, it's been really hard to find books specifically about biography with young children, and that's partially what this is. I don't know if it's going to be super useful to me yet, but again, trying to find stuff has just been hard. So if you have recommendations, let me know. And then if you think finding stuff about biography is hard, talking about picture books in American history has also been like a black hole of research. It's been really hard to do. But I did find Suspended Animation, Children's Picture Books, and the Fairy Tale of Modernity by Natalie Opdebeek. And this is a book, it's from 2008 now, I think, but it is the cultural context of picture books between the 1910s and the 1940s, and how the ideological bent of America shaped those picture books. And so I want to buy it. It's really interesting because so many people are like, no, we just publish children books that are optimistic and blah blah, but this is like, during the World Wars, using picture books as propaganda, but also using picture books during the, some ideological revolutions like the Industrial Revolution. So I'm excited for that. It's very nerdy. But it was that book actually that led me to this one, which, I don't have the cover for. I'm sorry. The cover for this is amazing. Maybe I'll put it in post. But it's called Empire's Nursery, Children's Literature and the Origins of the American Century by Brian Rolu. I'll put a picture up. But this is a book from 2021, which is great, first of all, because it's very up-to-date scholarship. But it is also how ideological ideas of American exceptionalism and American empire have been inserted in children's books, and not only how they've been inserted in children's books, but how children have acted on those ideals, which is very interesting, and brought up some books about, people railing against both picture books from the left and picture books from the right, and just some stuff that I hadn't heard before, so I'm going to buy my own copy. if only for the citations that are in here. And then, like I said, he also has really, really great chapter titles. They're amazing. How the West Was Fun. The comic book Cold War. So again, it's really up to date and interesting and adjacent to what I'm interested in. So I'm excited to get my own copy of that. So that is a lot of really nerdy books that I've actually bought myself recently. So none of that may have been interesting to you, but thank you if you made it this far. And if you have recommendations based on what I talked about today, scholastic or otherwise, let me know. This is a rabbit hole. I'm sure I'm going to swerve in 16 directions by the time I get, it's like 5 years for this PhD. So I'll be here a while reading my nerdy books.